Hello and welcome back to game number 4 of the series Masters of the Chessboard, where we are going through Richard Reti's book Masters of the Chessboard, looking at each of the games in the book and Reti's analysis of these games. So this is the 4th game of the book and the first one where we are looking at Paul Morphy. Morphy being described by Reti as one of the most famous of all chess masters. He was born in New Orleans in 1837 and won first prize at the very first American Chess Congress in 1857, and travelled to Europe and won quite decisively in Europe as well before dying in 1884. The first game we're looking at is by Paul Morphy in 1855, where Morphy has the black pieces and his opponent is Alexander Meek, who has the white pieces. And we'll see Meek again a bit later on, actually, in one of the later games. Now, Reti offers a bit of analysis and description into Morphy's playing style. He says that open games nowadays are more easily understood by newer players and less advanced players. But the understanding of this wasn't really the case back in Morphy's day. And it's because of Morphy's play that we owe a lot of our understanding of the open game to him. Morphy's ability to just win a lot of open games and his superiority over the other players of his era is because he was perhaps one of the first people to understand a lot of the characteristics and the nature of open positions, and he had developed some fairly sound principles for how to play in open positions. Reti says that a position is called open after some of the center pawns have been exchanged. And he says that openings beginning with e4, e5 are often more likely to become open because often after e4, e5, d4 or d5 will often be played at some point or another, which will lead to an exchange of pawns in the center. However, after d4 and d5, there's often less. You're less likely to come to exchange many center pawns, and so the position will often remain quite closed. And open positions normally lead to a more lively game because you're able to develop your rooks and your queens to the open files in the center of the board. And because it's there's a lot of open files, and it can lead to very lively games, you have to bring your pieces out and develop them very quickly with minimal loss of time. And unfortunately, Morphy's opponents didn't really succeed in developing their pieces very quickly. Instead, they often indulged in fairly premature attacks when they didn't have a lot of pieces developed, or they may do the opposite and play very passive, very timid, very defensive moves. And the game we're going to see today is an example of someone playing for a very premature attack. And it starts off with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and d5 going into the Scotch game. One of my favorite openings this is. And e takes d4. Now, Reti offers a bit of analysis into this opening and openings in general, and it's quite insightful actually for some of the newer players. He says that although e takes d4 isn't a developing move, it doesn't really represent a loss of time because white, after recapturing with the knight, would have spent another move would have moved a piece which has already been developed. So the number of tempos remains quite equal. However, after knight takes d4, if black was to recapture the knight here, this would constitute a loss of time for black because white now has a pawn in the center and a piece developed in the center. And we often hear that pieces, like the queen being in the center of the board in the opening, is often a mistake because it can be kicked around. Essentially, your opponent can often develop with tempos on the queen. However, in this instance, it isn't really the case. And this isn't something you'll often see at the club level when people play the Scotch. People will often exchange here because they they either don't know what they're doing, or they might think that the queen's in the center of the board, they can try and kick it around. But this isn't really the case. If you play c5 to try and kick the queen, well, you're just weakening a d6 square, and this is a bit of quite a big strategic error. You may also see something like knight e7 going to knight c6 in an attempt to attack the queen, but again, it is 2 moves just to win a 1 tempo on the queen. The only other move you might see quite common is something like queen f6, but then the 2 most common moves after this is bishop e3. So then after the queen's exchange, you take back with a bishop, and again you're left with a piece developed and a center pawn, and black has nothing. Alternatively, after queen f6, you could just push e5, gain space in the center, and kick their queen away, because their queen is in a position where it can be kicked. Your queen isn't. And Reti contrasts this scenario where white has a developed piece that's fairly safe in the center and a central pawn. He contrasts this to what would happen after the Scandinavian, where, okay, currently black has a piece developed in the center of the board, but after knight c3, you're able to develop with a tempo on this queen. And often black will play queen a5, and sooner or later they will have to play probably c6, because they're going to have to retreat this queen again to one of these squares, because otherwise they would just be at risk of losing it. So this does constitute a lack of time, because after they move, again, white can now either control the center or they can develop their pieces. And therefore white will be ahead in development and will probably be able to stay ahead in development. Now, Reti also talks about this opening in general. He says that after knight takes d4, it's important to perhaps look at what the ideas of this opening is. I'll put it on the board. So he says that currently white's at a bit of an advantage. They have a pawn in the center and 1 piece developed. Black has a piece developed and no pawns in the center. And therefore black's main aim should be to develop as quickly as possible and to challenge this pawn in the center. They can challenge it by either trying to attack it and just outright take it, or by trying to prepare d5 in order to exchange it off. d5 currently isn't very good, but instead the black player can perhaps try something like knight f6 to attack the pawn and also control the d5 square. Knight c3 is a common move to defend the pawn. You may also see knight takes here, but knight c3 is probably the more common move. Bishop b4, pinning the knight and therefore renewing this attack on the pawn. And now a common move may be that you want to defend this pawn with a bishop, so you may take here and then play the bishop. But here black is already able to play d5 because this pawn is defending. And this is a variation that Reti gives. There's quite a few different variations you can go for in the Scotch, but he says that all of this is focused around the ideas of the opening. The idea is to try and exchange off this pawn with the d5 pawn, and that's what black should be doing. So black shouldn't need to focus on learning all these different opening variations and things. They should instead try and understand what the opening itself calls for. And in this instance, it calls for black to try and take this pawn or exchange it off. And all of the moves that black makes should be to that effect. And therefore, all of white's moves should be to try and control the d5 square and defend the e4 pawn. Now in the game, we don't actually see knight takes d4. Even though Reti talks about it in detail, what we actually see is bishop c4, going into the Scotch gambit. And this move is sort of a pawn sacrifice. You're sort of sacrificing this pawn on d4 in an attempt to get a lot of rapid development. And this isn't really. This is a fairly equal opening, and it's not a bad move at all. You are getting a lot of rapid development. You're getting a lot of compensation for the pawn, and very often you will end up recapturing this pawn in one way or another anyway. However, in this game we see that White actually makes a mistake. Instead of playing for rapid development in the theme of the opening, they instead try and go for a premature attack. Now Morphy responds bishop c5, and in the game Meek plays knight g5. There's two potential correct moves here, two common moves. Castling is one option, completely fine option. Another option would be something like c3, where black would usually have a couple of options. They could play d take c3, and then the most common variation is this. An alternative variation could be something like knight f6, where we transpose into the gioco piano, the center attack, the Italian game, where you can potentially play e5, you could take on d4, and you could potentially even castle here. e5 is the main move. Taking and castling can often lead to very drawish positions. Yeah, this position can be reached via the Italian game, which I will show quickly. After e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, we then have c3. Then after knight f6, attacking this pawn, we have d4. Then after e takes d4, we then have the same position that we were in before. However, White didn't go for this c3 push. Instead, they played knight g5, which Reti describes as being a mistake for two reasons. Firstly, and most obviously, White's moving the same piece twice in the opening, so has already lost the tempo and given an advantage to black. And secondly, because White isn't really fighting for control of the center. This move does nothing to try and dominate the center, and therefore he's giving black the opportunity to control the center. Morphy replies with knight h6, because obviously White is attacking this f7 pawn. So Morphy replies with knight h6, defending this pawn and developing at the same time. Knight e5 is a move which Reti comments on, and we will look at in a little bit actually. We'll see how this little combination plays out, and then we'll go back and compare it to knight e5. So Meek replies with knight takes f7, knight takes f7, bishop takes f7, king takes f7, queen h5 check. And the intention is to now pick up this bishop. And here Reti offers a bit of analysis here. He says that this combination of Meeks will often meet some degree of approval by beginner players. However, an experienced player will often be a bit more suspicious of this combination, because all of White's developed pieces have essentially disappeared from the board except for the queen, and the queen on c5 can be pushed around by black when black is able to develop with tempos on this queen, which is what we will see. Now, if we contrast this, let's actually play a few moves first. So queen takes c5. So here black's goal will be to try and develop very quickly. So something like d6 will develop with a tempo on the queen, and then that will open up this file. Black can also develop here with a tempo on the pawn. And so, although White has a piece developed and a pawn in the center, just like black, White is going to be behind several moves, and black is going to be able to develop very quickly without White ever really having the opportunity to get pieces out, because black can develop all of their pieces with tempos on this queen. Now, if we contrast this, instead of this knight h6 move, if instead Morphy played knight e5 defending this, Morphy will be making the same mistake that Meek did and moving the same piece twice in the opening. And with the same combination, we can see straight away that there's quite a difference here. Although white has exchanged most of their developed pieces apart from this queen, black has also exchanged all of their developed pieces. This queen can be under attack, but it can also take the pawn with tempos, and this is therefore a better position for white. White has the advantage here. Black doesn't. And in the actual game, black has the advantage here because they've got the development lead, they've got the control of the center, and they've got the ability to develop with a tempo. But with the knight e5, black didn't really have any of that. And we'll see now how Morphy uses this to his advantage, how he's able to develop with tempos on the queen. Plays d6, opening a line for the bishop, forcing the queen to move. Then rook e8, again developing the rook to an open line and attacking the pawn at the same time. Meek applies the queen b3 check, and Reti says that Meek moving the queen about this often is simply losing time. Even though it's with check, it's simply losing time. He should have castled here, really. Morphy responds with d5, bearing in mind this pawn is still pinned, so it can't be taken. And here Morphy blocks a check with a move that dominates the center. Meek replies f3 to try and defend this pawn. And then Morphy plays knight a5, attacking the queen, forcing the queen to move to d3. But after d takes e4, attacking the queen again with another tempo, with f takes e4. Now queen h4 check, developing the queen with a tempo. g3, and now rook takes e3 check. Interestingly, the computer gives queen takes e4 check, and the computer's line actually goes for a favourable endgame with bishop g4, e1, rook takes e1, rook takes e1, then rook e8 check, king f1, c4, knight a3, take, take, and then rook e2. So this is the computer's line, and it's quite a clearly a one endgame for black. White's pawn structure is ruined. Black's pawn structure is really quite nice. White's pieces are undeveloped. Black's pieces are very well developed, and there's a rook on the second rank. One of these pawns is almost certainly going to fall. So it's clearly a one endgame for black. But instead, Morphy plays rook takes e4 check, going for a far more interesting middle game and a mating attack, which is just what you'd expect from someone like Paul Morphy. And realistically, there's only really one move which can sort of hold, and that's bishop e3, which again just gives away the bishop. But white instead plays king f2. And now Morphy plays queen e7, knight d2, and Morphy's pieces are very much focused on this e2 square, and this is the focal point of Morphy's attack. And you'll see how Morphy will now try and develop his pieces and push around this queen, because this queen is the only defender of the e2 square. And so all of Morphy's focus will be on trying to remove the defender of this e2 square. So he plays rook e3, forcing the queen to move. Again, still defending the e2 square. c6, queen f1, still trying to defend the e2 square. Bishop h3, forcing the queen to move to d1. The queen can't take on h3, because after rook e2 check, notice the queen gave up control of this e2 focal point. Queen f3, queen f1 and e1 will be met with a mate. I'll quickly play it out. That's checkmate. No, it's not. That's not checkmate. that's checkmate. So king f3 would be forced in this position after the bishop takes, and then we have queen e3 check, king g4, and then h5 check. And the only way to delay queen e7 mate is to simply sacrifice the queen. But even that is a mate in 6 according to the computer. So instead of taking the bishop, Meek plays queen d1, again trying to defend this e2 square. And Morphy replies with rook f8. And here Reti makes a comment that beginners who often, in the heat of battle almost, will often only play with pieces that are already engaged and are already active and already playing, rather than trying to bring up their pieces in reserve. And I think this move is especially one which may be a little bit harder to find for beginners, because the rook isn't being brought into the game immediately. It's going to take another move to get it into the game. You're going to have to move the king again for it to come into the game. And so this move might be a bit hard for beginners to find because it's not an immediately forcing move. Meek replies with knight f3, trying to close off this open line. But after king e8, Meek resigns anyway. So the threat here, if white just does if white does nothing, the threat would be queen e4, which is mate in 3. And again, if we do nothing, mate in 3 is unstoppable. But if we do nothing, we have rook f takes f3 check. And after queen takes f3, rook takes f3 check, king g1, we then have either rook f1 mate or queen e1 mate. So now if white tried to put up a bit of an active resistance with something like rook e1 to try and trade off some pieces, the response would be rook takes f3 check, and white's only got 2 moves. They play king g1. This will lead to a mate in 2, because after rook takes e1, queen takes e1, queen takes e1 is mate. So instead of playing king g1, they would have to sacrifice the queen. And it may look okay, because after this takes, the queen will be hanging. But instead, you can take with check, so the queen isn't hanging. King takes f3, and then queen takes e1. And this is actually a mate in 8, but even if Morphy missed the mate in 8, which is very unlikely for Morphy, you've got a queen and a knight for a rook. It's clearly a 1 game for Morphy here. And so there we have it. That's game number 4 and the first of the Morphy games. And we've got quite a few Morphy games. I think we've got 5 Morphy games in total in this book, and they will all have quite a similar theme in that Morphy will very much focus on developing very fast and dominating the center as quickly as possible, and playing openings which create open lines and open files for him to use to his advantage. So this game is very much what you'd expect from Morphy. And with 4 extra games, I think we're going to see quite a few more beautiful masterpieces like this. So thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment and subscribe. And I hope to see you at game number 5. Thank you for watching.